What would you do if the one thing your lost love left you was a hole in the ground? When Thomas died, everyone in Absaroka Valley expected his widow, Anya, to sell the ranch. They expected she would take the pittance offered by Marcus Thorne, the man whose land surrounded her own like a tightening fist, and disappear back east. Instead, she took the worn leather satchel containing her husband's final plans and a stubborn set to her jaw. People called it the widow's folly. They pointed from the porch of the general store as she and her loyal German shepherd, Kaiser, spent their days not mending fences, but digging. They laughed when they heard she was finishing the project that had made Thomas a local eccentric before the fever took him, an underground barn. A tomb for her horses, Marcus Thorne had said, his voice carrying easily across the dusty street. A fitting monument to a failed man, but when Anya finally turned the last page of her husband's journal, she found a truth buried deeper than any stable, a secret sealed with surveyor's ink and quiet desperation. The truth would change everything. The town just didn't know it yet. They saw a woman consumed by grief, digging a grave for her own future. They saw a broken plot of land. What they couldn't see was the legacy coiled deep in the cold earth, waiting for the first frost to reveal its power. They couldn't feel the faint warmth seeping from the rock, a promise only Anya and her dog, with his nose to the ground, seemed to understand. The first month after the funeral was a study in silence and dust. Anya's world had shrunk to the dimensions of her small cabin, the scent of her husband's pipe smoke still clinging to the curtains. Her only companions were Kaiser, whose quiet presence was a steady anchor in the tide of her grief, and Samuel, the old ranch hand who had worked for Thomas's father. Samuel never spoke of the digging unless asked. He'd show up at dawn with his own shovel, his movement slow but deliberate, his face a roadmap of prairie winds and unspoken loyalty. He'd work beside her for hours, the only sounds the scrape of steel on rock and Kaiser's occasional low whine as he tracked a rabbit along the ridge. The mockery from the valley was a constant, low hum. Riders would slow their horses on the main track, pointing at the growing mound of excavated earth beside the cabin. Still at it, Anya, one would call out, a thin smile on his lips. She would just nod, never looking up, her hands tight on the shovel's handle. Marcus Thorne made his second visit then. He rode up on a magnificent black stallion, the leather of his saddle creaking with an air of expensive permanence. He didn't dismount. He said, his voice dripping with false concern. "This is no work for a woman alone. My offer still stands. Enough to see you settled somewhere decent." Anya finally looked up, her eyes clear and cold as a winter stream. "I'm already somewhere decent, Mr. Thorne," she replied, her voice steady. He chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "That hole won't protect you from the winter." It didn't protect your husband from his own foolishness. He spurred his horse and rode away, leaving the scent of contempt hanging in the air. That night, Anya laid out Thomas's schematics on the rough-hewn table. They were more than simple drawings, they were a language of angles, depths, and strange notation she was only beginning to decipher. Kaiser rested his head on her lap, his deep brown eyes fixed on her face. She ran a hand over his fur. He wasn't a fool, was he, boy? The dog let out a soft huff, a sound of absolute agreement. The work was brutal. The sun baked the earth into a hard pan that shattered into jagged plates under the shovel. Anya's hands, once soft, became calloused and raw. She learned the rhythm of the work: dig, lift, haul, dump. Repeat. Samuel taught her how to brace the deepening walls with timber scavenged from a collapsed line shack, his instructions brief and practical. "Mind the slide," he'd murmur, pointing to a fissure in the clay. "The earth has a memory." Kaiser was her shadow, his keen ears alerting them to the rattle of a snake in the brush or the distant approach of a rider long before they could see them. He often lay at the edge of the excavation, a silent, watchful guardian, his black and tan coat coated in a fine layer of dust. One afternoon, as she cleared a section of stubborn rock, her shovel struck something that wasn't stone. It was a small, iron-bound chest, no bigger than a loaf of bread. It was heavy, and the lock was crusted with rust and dirt. She and Samuel carried it back to the cabin as dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and faded gold. Thomas never mentioned a box, Samuel said, his brow furrowed as he examined the lock. He kept his secrets close. Anya felt a tremor of anticipation, a feeling she hadn't experienced since before the illness. This was something more than just a forgotten strongbox. It felt like a message. She found the key on a thin leather cord tucked into the back of Thomas's journal, a place she had overlooked a dozen times. It was a simple, skeletal key, cold to the touch. With Kaiser watching intently from the floor, she fitted the key into the lock. It resisted, then turned with a loud, grating crack that echoed in the quiet room. The truth was waiting inside. The lid of the chest creaked open, releasing the scent of old paper and dry leather. Inside, there were no coins, no deeds to forgotten claims. There was only a stack of carefully folded documents, a geological survey map, and a thin, leather-bound ledger. Anya lifted the map first. It was a detailed rendering of her land, but unlike any she had seen before. It was covered in contour lines and symbols, with a single, bold X marked directly beneath the site of their excavation. Cross-sections drawn in the margin showed the layers of rock and soil, and deep beneath them, a shaded blue area labeled Aquifer Terminus. The accompanying survey report, penned by a state geologist from a city she'd never heard of, spoke of a unique geothermal phenomenon. It described a deep artesian spring, heated by the Earth's core, that pushed warm water up through a fault line, ending just shy of the surface. The ground here, the report concluded, will never truly freeze. Anya's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Samuel, whose eyes were wide as he read over her shoulder. The underground barn wasn't a madman's fantasy. It was a work of brilliant, desperate engineering. Thomas hadn't been digging a tomb, he was building a sanctuary, a stable that would be naturally heated through the most brutal of winters by the earth itself. The final document was a set of water rights, officially filed and stamped, granting Thomas, and now her, exclusive access to the subterranean spring. He had secured the one thing no one in the valley even knew existed. He knew, she whispered, tracing the lines on the map with her finger. He knew a hard winter was coming. Samuel nodded slowly, a look of profound respect dawning on his weathered face. He wasn't just building a barn, Anya. He was building an ark. Kaiser stood up, stretched, and walked to the door, nudging it open with his nose. He stared out into the darkening twilight, as if he could already sense the change in the air. The first sign was the sky. For a week, it remained a flat, metallic gray, the sun a pale, distant wafer. The air grew still and heavy, carrying a sharp, biting cold that seemed to seep into the bones. The old-timers in the valley looked to the peaks of the mountains, which were shrouded in a thick, churning bank of clouds, and spoke in low tones of the winter of 78, a winter that had decimated herds and broken families. Marcus Thorne, however, was dismissive. He stood on the steps of the general store, projecting an aura of unshakable confidence. "My barns are solid," he announced to the worried ranchers gathered around him. "New timber, deep foundations. My stock will be fine. It's the unprepared who will suffer." His eyes flicked for a moment toward the road leading to Anya's property, a subtle but clear message. His words were a balm for some, but a challenge to others. The valley held its breath. The temperature began to drop. First by a few degrees, then by 10. The creeks and watering holes developed a thin skin of rime, then froze solid. Anya and Samuel worked with a new urgency, their movements economical and swift. They finished the wide, sloping ramp that led down into the earth, packed the dirt floor, and installed the heavy, insulated doors Thomas had designed. From the outside, it was still just a mound of earth with two huge wooden doors set into its face. But inside, it was a different world. The air was cool but not cold, and carried a faint, mineral scent. A steady, almost imperceptible warmth radiated from the packed earth walls. Anya led her two sturdy mares down the ramp. They went without hesitation, their ears pricked forward, their nostrils flaring as they took in the strange, warm air. Kaiser trotted confidently beside them, his tail held high. He explored every corner of the vast, subterranean space before settling near the entrance, a self-appointed sentinel. That night, the first flakes of snow began to fall. They were small and dry, skittering across the frozen ground. But as the night deepened, they grew larger and heavier, and a low moan began in the pines. The storm had arrived. By morning, the world had vanished. There was no valley, no mountains, no horizon, only a swirling, blinding vortex of white. The temperature, which had been hovering near zero, plummeted. The mercury in the town's official thermometer dropped to 10 below, then 20. At 22 below zero, it stopped, the marker frozen in place. The cold was a physical presence, a predator. It found every crack in every wall, every gap in every door frame. It was a suffocating, absolute cold that stole the breath and burned the lungs. News traveled slowly, passed by the few desperate souls who dared to venture out. The reports were grim. Barn doors had been blasted from their hinges by the force of the gale. Roofs, heavy with snow, were groaning under the strain. Livestock, caught in the open, were found frozen solid, standing like statues of ice. Inside his sprawling ranch house, Marcus Thorne was no longer confident. The new timber of his state-of-the-art barn had shrunk in the extreme cold, opening up small gaps. Through these gaps, the wind howled, driving snow into the stalls. His prize stallion, a creature of immense value and pride, was shivering violently, its coat rimed with frost despite the thick blankets covering it. His other horses huddled together for warmth, their breath pluming in the frigid air like ghosts. He had done everything right, everything the experts advised. He had spent a fortune. And it was not enough. The cold was indifferent to his wealth. It was a force of nature that was dismantling his empire one shivering animal at a time. Back at her cabin, Anya stoked the fire. Outside, the storm raged, but her small home was secure, banked with earth from the excavation. Down below, in the silent warmth of the underground stable, her two mares stood calmly, munching on hay. Kaiser lay by the hearth, his ears twitching at the sound of the wind, but his body was relaxed. He knew they were safe. The storm wasn't their enemy. It was the thing Thomas had prepared them for all along. The knock on her door came on the second day of the storm. It was not a polite rap but a frantic, desperate pounding. Kaiser was on his feet in an instant, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Anya quieted him with a hand on his back as she peered through the small opening in the door. It was Marcus Thorne. He was almost unrecognizable. His face was pale and gaunt, his expensive coat was covered in snow, and his eyes held a look of raw, humbled panic. He wasn't on his horse. He had walked, a sign of true desperation. Anya, he began, his voice hoarse, the name sounding foreign on his tongue. He didn't use the formalism. I'm my barn. The wind. It's not holding. My stallion. He won't make it through another night. He stopped, his pride warring with his fear. He looked past her, toward the great earthen mound and the two massive doors. He looked at the place he had mocked, the project he had derided as a tomb. He was a man standing on the edge of a cliff, and the only bridge was one he had tried to burn. Anya said nothing for a long moment. She just looked at him, her expression unreadable. The wind tore at his clothes, and he flinched against its biting force. Kaiser continued his low, steady growl, a clear signal of his distrust. Anya could have turned him away. She could have savored the moment, repeating his own cruel words back to him. The entire valley would have understood. But she thought of Thomas, of the quiet determination in his eyes when he talked about his plans. He wasn't building it for revenge or for pride. He was building it to protect life. Your horses, she said, her voice quiet but clear over the howl of the wind. Not just the stallion. All of them. Thorne stared at her, confusion and a dawning, reluctant gratitude in his eyes. He nodded, unable to speak. Samuel is down there, she continued. Take your men. Bring them. Use the west pasture trail, it's more sheltered. She closed the door before he could reply, leaving him alone in the storm with his shock and his instructions. Leading a horse through a blizzard is a battle against a merciless enemy. Thorne and his men fought for every foot, the wind tearing at them, the snow blinding them. The animals were terrified, their eyes wide, their bodies trembling uncontrollably. But the promise of shelter, of warmth, drove them forward. When they finally reached Anyar's property, the two huge barn doors were open, spilling a rectangle of calm, dim light into the swirling chaos. Samuel stood just inside, a lantern in his hand, his face grim. "Get them in, quickly," he called out, his voice nearly snatched away by the wind. One by one, they led the horses down the wide, non-slip earthen ramp. The moment the animals crossed the threshold, the change was immediate and profound. The deafening roar of the wind vanished, replaced by a deep, resonant silence. The biting cold was gone, replaced by a gentle, steady warmth that rose from the very ground they stood on. The horses stopped shivering. They lowered their heads, their breath coming out in easy clouds, not panic plumes. They had entered a different world. Thorn was the last one down. He stood at the bottom of the ramp and slowly turned, taking in the scene. The vast, vaulted space was filled with animals. His own shivering thoroughbred stood next to Anyar's calm mares. Soon, other ranchers, their own barns failing, began to arrive. They came in small, desperate groups, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion, leading the last of their herds. No one spoke. There was no need. They simply led their animals into the warm earth, finding a space along the walls. Anyar stood near the entrance, Kaiser sitting faithfully at her side. She watched as the community, fractured by gossip and judgment, was brought together in shared vulnerability. She offered no words of blame or triumph. She simply offered sanctuary. Marcus Thorne approached her, his hat in his hands. He looked at the dozens of horses, safe and warm. He looked at the genius of the simple, brilliant design. "I don't understand," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "How?" Anyar looked at him, her gaze direct. "My husband was a good man," she said. It was the only explanation necessary. When the storm finally broke on the fourth day, it revealed a landscape of brutal purity. The valley was buried under a blanket of white, the silence absolute. Drifts were piled as high as rooftops, and the world seemed scoured clean. The survivors emerged slowly, blinking in the pale sunlight. The news of what Anyar had done spread just as slowly, passed from one exhausted rancher to the next. They called it the miracle of Absaroka Valley. A week later, a woman arrived on a sturdy horse, leading a pack mule. She introduced herself as Dr. Eve Ross, a veterinarian and inspector for the territory. She had been sent to assess the livestock losses in the region. She had heard the stories and came to see for herself. Anyar led her down into the barn. Dr. Ross walked the length of the structure, her expression a mixture of professional curiosity and sheer astonishment. She ran her hand along the earthen walls, felt the ambient heat, and inspected the calm, healthy horses. "I've never seen anything like it," she said, her voice echoing in the vast space. "This is revolutionary." Anyar showed her Thomas's plans, the geological survey, and the water rights. Dr. Ross read them carefully, her eyebrows rising higher with each page. "These rights are ironclad," she stated, tapping the stamped document. "He didn't just find a spring, he secured it. This water, this heat. It makes this the single most valuable piece of land in this entire territory." Mrs. Thorne, she had misspoken the name. "It's not Thorne," Anyar corrected her gently. "It's my husband's name." "The name of the man who built this place." Dr. Ross nodded, a look of deep respect in her eyes. "Of course. A legacy like this deserves its proper name." Her official report would validate everything, cementing Anyar's legal and moral victory not with force, but with undeniable truth. The thaw came, and the valley slowly returned to life. The snow receded, revealing the devastating toll of the storm. Marcus Thorne lost nearly a third of his cattle and his reputation was in tatters. He sold off a large parcel of his land to cover his losses and was rarely seen in town. He never spoke to Anyar again, but when their paths did cross, he could not meet her eyes. Anyar's ranch, however, thrived. The story of the underground barn became a local legend, a tale told to children about the quiet man who saw what no one else could and the widow who finished his work. Ranchers who had once mocked her now came to her, not with pity, but with respect, asking for advice on watering their stock or wintering their herds. She never withheld her help. The land, once seen as broken and unlucky, was now viewed as a sanctuary. The warmth from the deep spring seemed to permeate the soil, and her pastures were the first to turn green that spring. The Falls project had become the valley's heart. One evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows from the mountains, Anya stood on the ridge overlooking her property. Her 2 mares grazed peacefully in the pasture below. The great earthen mound of the barn was already becoming part of the landscape, a gentle swell in the earth that held an incredible secret. Kaiser came and stood beside her, leaning his weight against her leg. She rested her hand on his head, the familiar feel of his fur a comfort. She was no longer just the widow. She was a pillar of the community, the guardian of her husband's legacy. She had faced down grief, mockery, and the worst nature could throw at her, and she had endured. She had not just survived, she had prevailed. The wind picked up, but it was a gentle evening breeze, not the raging gale of winter. It carried the scent of pine and damp earth. It was the smell of resilience. It was the smell of home.